At 7:42 on the morning of August 17th, 1942, I found myself under the wing of an A-20 Havoc at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, staring at sparks flying from a welding torch as if they were pieces of my own life burning away, and I knew right then that the war was about to demand more from me than it ever had before. My name is Paul Pappy Gunn, 43 years old, 21 years in the Navy, and as I crouched beneath that wing with the smell of hot metal in my nose and hammer blows ringing through the hangar, I watched my ground crew weld 4 .50 caliber machine guns into the nose where a bombardier once sat, the smoke curling upward like a warning about what was coming. I had worn many uniforms in my life, sailor, civilian pilot, now the old man of the 5th Air Force, but none of them had prepared me for the weight I carried that morning. My wife and our 4 children were locked behind barbed wire in Santo Tomas, Manila, prisoners of the Japanese for months, and every time I tried to picture their faces I felt the same blow of guilt. I was here, alive and armed, while they were trapped with nothing but fear and hunger for company. The war was not going our way. 5th Air Force was losing airplanes faster than Washington could ship replacements, and the month before, the 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20s trying to bomb Japanese convoys from high altitude. Drop from too high, and the bombs sailed past the moving ships. Drop lower, and the deck gunners tore our boys apart before their bombs ever left the racks. I had seen the burned-out wrecks of those A-20s scattered along the edges of our strips, their metal twisted, their cockpits empty forever, and the silence around them stuck with me more than any briefing. Pilots I knew by name, men I had eaten with, joked with, were gone because we were fighting a battle the wrong way. That morning I stood with my hands on the cold wing of the Havoc and asked myself a question I hadn't dared to say out loud. What if we didn't attack from above at all? What if we came in level with the sea, so low we could see our reflection in the water? The thought came quick, like someone had snapped their fingers in the dark, skip bombing, letting a bomb bounce across the waves like a flat stone skipping toward a ship's hull. I didn't know the details yet, but I knew one thing for certain as I breathed in the mix of sweat, oil and welding smoke. Nothing we were doing was working, and every day we hesitated was another day my family remained captive, and another day our boys died in burning airplanes that never had a chance. I couldn't free my family with machines that were losing this war, and if I wanted them to live long enough for me to reach them, then first I had to make sure Japanese ships died before they could bring death to us. When I first looked at the A-20 Havoc, I knew the airplane was tough, but its 4 little .30 caliber guns in the nose were about as useful against a Japanese transport ship as tossing pebbles at a steel door, and every time our boys tried to make a run at a convoy, those rounds just bounced off the armour like hail in a summer storm. I needed real hitting power, and the only place I could find it was in the wreckage of P-39s and P-40s that would never fly again. Their pilots long gone, but their 50 caliber guns still waiting to be used, and I remember thinking that if those men couldn't come back, at least their guns could keep fighting for them. So I bolted 4 of those 50s onto a steel frame inside the A-20's nose, each one weighing 64 pounds, plus 200 pounds of ammunition, and when I stepped back and looked at what I'd created, I realised I was staring at something no manual had ever mentioned. An airplane nose packed with firepower it was never designed to carry. The trouble showed up the moment we tried to fly it. With all that weight up front, the Havoc wanted to bury its nose in the ground like a scared mule. And on the first test run, the pilot had the stick pulled all the way back while the airplane kept sinking toward the runway. And as I watched it race toward the far end of the strip, I felt my stomach drop because I truly believed I'd just killed a friend. Somehow he coaxed it into the air, and when he landed again, I promised myself that if I was going to gamble with men's lives, I'd better make damn sure the odds were fair, so I spent the next 2 days moving equipment aft, shifting every pound I could, and trimming the tail until the balance felt right. The second test flight wasn't pretty. After landing, the pilot told me the airplane flew like it was angry, but the important thing was that it flew. And on September 12th, when 16 of those modified A-20s went in low over Buna Airfield, skimming the treetops with the 50s roaring like a chainsaw tearing through steel, they wiped out 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground and silenced every anti-aircraft position without losing a single plane. I didn't cheer, that wasn't my way. I just felt a hard, quiet satisfaction settle in my chest, the kind a man gets when something dangerous finally works the way he prayed it would. But even in that moment, as I watched those A-20s return safely, I knew the truth. They still didn't have the range or the bomb load we needed for the bigger fight that was coming. The moment I realised the A-20 would never carry us far enough or hit hard enough for the battle still waiting out there, I turned to the only airframe I believe could handle the kind of madness I had in mind. The B-25 Mitchell, a big, tough machine with longer range, heavier bomb load, and a nose wide enough for me to cram in the firepower I knew we needed. I stripped out the bombardier's station and pulled the old nose guns, then mounted 4 50 caliber guns straight ahead in the nose, added 4 more in external cheek packs on either side, and rotated the top turret forward so its guns joined the line of fire. After that, I bolted 2 more .50s into each side of the fuselage until the airplane carried 14 forward-firing guns that could throw 215 pounds of lead every second, and when I stepped back and looked at the thing, even I wondered if I had finally pushed my luck too far. The ground crew and the pilots didn't bother hiding their opinions. They nicknamed it Pappy's Folly, the old man's crazy stunt, and when I watched that first modified B-25 roll toward the runway, its nose dipping under the weight of all that steel, I felt the same question pressing in on me. Had I crossed the line between ingenuity and foolishness? The answer started to come during the demonstration flight to Charters Towers. On takeoff, the airplane fought us, the nose wanting to drop so hard the pilot had to pull the stick all the way back just to keep it level, and for a few long seconds it felt as if the B-25 might simply give up and settle into the ground. But then it clawed its way into the air, heavy and angry, and once it levelled off I squeezed the trigger and felt the entire aircraft shudder as 14 50s roared at once. The vibration deep in the bones, the kind that tells you you're sitting inside a flying destroyer instead of a bomber. That was the moment I knew the idea wasn't folly at all. It was exactly what the war demanded, and General Kenny didn't waste time. He ordered a dozen more conversions immediately. Down in Townsville, the men of the 81st Air Depot Group worked 18 hours a day, turning every available B-25 into a copy of that first beast. And while I was proud of what we had built, there was a part of me that stayed uneasy, because I knew the line between saving men and getting them killed was razor thin, and with every new gun I added to those airplanes, I felt like I was walking that line in the dark. Not long after we proved the B-25 could carry the kind of firepower I'd forced into its nose, General Kenny sent my blueprints to Wright Field in Ohio, and word came back faster than I expected. The engineers said my design would throw the airplane out of balance, make it too heavy up front, and keep it from flying the way a B-25 was supposed to fly, and their recommendation was simple: ground every modified aircraft before someone got killed. I wasn't in Washington when Kenny met with them, but he told me the story later, and I could picture it as if I'd been standing beside him. A room full of engineers ready to explain why my work was impossible, why no airplane could survive what I had done to it, and Kenny walking in and cutting them off by saying that 12 of those impossible airplanes had just helped sink a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. He didn't need to say more. That news must have hit them like a hammer. We would talk about that battle later, but for now it was enough to know the men on the ground had witnessed something the blueprints alone couldn't explain. The truth was, the fight wasn't over. On February 28, 1943, our codebreakers intercepted Japanese signals about a convoy leaving Rabaul, 8 transport ships, 8 destroyers, nearly 7,000 troops headed for Lae on the north coast of New Guinea, and as soon as I heard it, I knew exactly what it meant. March was monsoon season, with low clouds, heavy rain, and visibility so poor you sometimes couldn't see the wingtips, and the Japanese were counting on that weather to shield them, believing no bomber could find a convoy hidden under that kind of sky. But intelligence has a way of stripping away illusions, and we knew the convoy would cross the Bismarck Sea whether the sun was shining or the heavens were pouring. For me, it wasn't just another operation. If those troops reached Lae, New Guinea could tilt in Japan's favour, and once New Guinea fell, the road to the Philippines would open, and my family was still trapped in Manila, held behind barbed wire while Japanese guards walked the perimeter with rifles. So when the orders came down to prepare the strike, it wasn't strategy I felt first. It was something deep in my gut telling me this convoy had to be stopped, no matter the risk. The plan was straightforward on paper. B-17s would go in high to pull the Japanese guns upward, while our modified B-25s and A-20s would come in low, almost at wave-top height, and the P-38s would keep the Zero fighters off our backs. Standing beside one of my B-25s as the crews loaded ammunition, I ran my hand along the metal skin and thought about the engineers in Ohio who said the plane couldn't fly with the guns I'd packed into it. Maybe they were right in theory, but theory doesn't bleed, and theory doesn't win battles. I knew the truth as well as any man there. If my guns were wrong, we would die fast. But if they were right, then the entire war in the Southwest Pacific was about to change. At 6:30 on the morning of March 3rd, 1943, I stood on Cape Ward Hunt and watched 137 Allied aircraft gather in the grey light. The kind of dawn that feels heavy on your shoulders, as if the sky itself knows something terrible is about to happen. The B-17s circled high above us, waiting to begin their run from the altitude where they were safest, while my strafers, the B-25s we had turned into gunships, formed up at wave-top height, so low the prop wash rippled across the surface of the sea. When the 12 B-25 strafers slid into formation, each one pointing 1450 caliber guns straight ahead, the sight made my throat tighten. To my eyes, they looked less like bombers, and more like a moving wall of gun barrels, a sheet of firepower ready to tear a hole straight through whatever stood in front of it. I climbed aboard one of the aircraft to ride along for the mission, and as we dropped to 50 feet above the water, the ocean looked close enough to touch, every white cap flashing past like a warning. The Japanese convoy came into view through the morning haze, 8 transports and 8 destroyers spread across the Bismarck Sea, and the first target in our path was the transport Kyokusei Maru. When our strafers opened fire, the 50 caliber rounds walked across the surface of the sea like steel footsteps, hitting the water, bouncing upward, then chewing into the ship's hull. I could see the bullets climbing the superstructure, ripping into the bridge and tearing through the gun crews before they could swing their weapons toward us. At about 100 yards out, the first skip bomb was released. It hit the water flat, skipped once like a stone, then slammed into the hull below the waterline and detonated inside the engine room with a blast that lifted smoke straight into the sky. In less than half an hour, the ship was burning and dead in the water. The next victim, Teo Maru, tried to flee at 15 knots, its engines screaming for every bit of speed they could muster, but we were coming in at 240 knots. The difference felt like an old truck trying to outrun a freight train. 4 B-25s bracketed the ship from both sides, and I heard over the radio the moment the bombs hit, 5 direct strikes, followed by the shocked report that the ship had broken clean in half, its bow and stern folded away from each other, sliding beneath the surface like 2 sinking doors. As the battle went on, our radios filled with call signs and the cold, clipped voices of crews reporting hits, fires, and sinking ships. By the end of the afternoon, 8 Japanese transports were gone, and 4 destroyers had joined them. Out of nearly 7,000 Japanese troops that left Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh. About 2,700 were picked up by their escorts and hauled back toward Rabaul, and the rest, thousands of men, vanished into the sea. Our own casualties came through as well. 1 B-17 lost, 3 P-38s shot down, 13 aircrew dead. When the shooting stopped and the last plumes of smoke drifted across the water, I didn't celebrate. I just sat there listening to the engines cool and thought about the strange truth of what had happened. Those ridiculous guns I had forced into the B-25's nose, those guns the engineers said would never work, had saved more American lives in one morning than I could ever count, and at the same time they had sent a staggering number of Japanese soldiers to the bottom. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was something quieter, heavier. I understood right then that Japan would never again try to reinforce New Guinea by convoy, and that the path to the Philippines had just shifted in our favour. The sea below us was calm by evening, but it felt different now, as if it knew what had happened in its waters, and what those 14 guns had done. On March 5th, just 2 days after the Bismarck Sea turned into a graveyard for the Japanese convoy, General Kenny sent a message to General Hap Arnold with a subject line that said everything. Commerce Destroyer modifications approved for production. In the body of that telegram, he told Washington exactly what my modified B-25 strafers had done, 12 of them helping to wipe out an entire convoy, and he recommended that the forward gun package be built into every B-25 rolling off the assembly line. When Kenny told me I had orders to go to California to work with North American Aviation, the news hit me hard. My family was still imprisoned in Manila, and every mile I put between myself and the Philippines felt like betrayal. I told Kenny I wanted to stay close, that I needed to be there when the day came to take the islands back, but he looked me straight in the eye and said, "If you want hundreds more strafers, you have to go. This is an order." So on March 27th, 1943, I walked into the North American plant in Long Beach and felt like I had stepped into another world. The place covered 140 acres, 20,000 men and women working in 3 shifts, and a brand new B-25 rolled off the line every 4 hours, a pace that made even wartime mechanics shake their heads. The engineers were sharp, well-trained, and curious, and the first thing they asked me for was stress calculations, wind tunnel test results, weight and balance data, all the things a designer is supposed to bring. I told them I tested the design in the only wind tunnel that mattered, combat. If I'd been wrong, my pilots would have been dead long before I reached California. Once they realized I wasn't joking, we got to work turning my field fixes into something the factories could reproduce. I showed them how I'd moved the radio aft to compensate for the weight of the guns, how I'd reinforced the nose, and how I'd welded blast tubes to carry the muzzle flash past the propeller arc so the skin wouldn't peel back like paper. They took those ideas and refined them the right way. Thicker aluminum around the cheek guns, recalculated centre of gravity numbers, tail trim settings determined by math instead of gut instinct. The first true production version, the B-25G, rolled out with 4x50 calibers in the nose and a 75 mm M4 cannon mounted in the forward fuselage, a tank gun capable of punching holes in a destroyer. On my first test shot, the cannon kicked backward 4 feet, and the whole airplane shook so hard I felt it in my teeth, while the navigator had to reload each round by hand, giving us a rate of 1 shot every 30 seconds. The follow-up model, the B-25H, carried even more 50 calibers and had an improved recoil system that let the cannon fire every 20 seconds, which made it deadly against anything slow or armoured. Then came the B-25J. The gunship pushed to its logical extreme with the 75mm cannon removed, and 18 forward-firing 50 calibers packed into its frame. The heaviest armed production bomber the world had ever seen. Standing on the factory floor surrounded by machines I had helped redesign, I felt a strange mix of pride and worry. Pride because the ideas that began as battlefield improvisation had become real aircraft, and worry because every improvement we made meant more young men would fly into danger using something I had created. When I returned to Australia in May of 1943, exactly 6 weeks after Kenny promised I'd be back, I found a different kind of war waiting for me. The factory-built strafers were arriving now, tougher, cleaner and more reliable than the field mod versions we'd hammered together under corrugated roofs, and from that point on the fight became a long chain of missions that rolled one into the next. In April, our B-25s tore into 16 Japanese barges hauling troops and supplies near Finschhafen, the kind of small, fast-moving targets that used to slip past us but couldn't hide anymore once 1450s lit up the water around them. In May, we hit Wewak Harbour and sent a dozen Japanese cargo ships to the bottom, burning from bow to stern, and a month later in June, our strafers and bombers smashed the oil facilities at Balikpapan, Borneo, a blow that forced the Japanese to stretch their supply lines thin and rethink every move they made in the region. The Japanese responded the only way they could. They stopped running ships during daylight. But hiding in darkness didn't save them for long, because we learned to hunt at night, flying at 50 feet with nothing but radar and instinct to guide us. It was a strange kind of flying, low and blind, feeling the ocean more than seeing it, and on some nights we worked with PT boats that flashed their searchlights at the last second to silhouette the target for us, a brief white blaze that gave us just enough time to drop our bombs before the darkness closed again. Somewhere in that stretch of months, the Japanese started calling our modified B-25s Black Death, a name that sounded like something out of the Middle Ages, and the first time I heard it I felt a twist in my chest. There was no honour in being called a plague, but if that name meant the war would end sooner, and if ending sooner meant my family in Manila would see daylight again, then I could live with it. What surprised me most wasn't the nickname, it was how fast the idea spread. Before long I was hearing reports from other theatres. In the Mediterranean, B-25 strafers were cutting through German convoys trying to supply North Africa, and in the China-Burma-India theatre, the same kind of nose-heavy, gun-packed bombers were hammering Japanese supply lines along the Burma Road. Every week brought new stories from places I'd never set foot in, and each one carried the same strange echo. That a handful of hand-drawn sketches I'd scribbled in Brisbane had turned into firepower, burning across half the world. I never thought of myself as an inventor, but listening to those reports, I realized something had changed. The war had taken my rough ideas, the ones born out of desperation, and spread them far beyond the jungle strips where I'd first tested them. And whether I liked the nickname or not, the Black Death was no longer just ours. It belonged to every crew flying into danger with those guns leading the way. By late 1944, the 5th Air Force was using the Strafer the way I always hoped they would, as a decisive weapon, and I was flying more missions than I should have, sleeping too little, pushing myself because every mile we gained toward the Philippines felt like a mile closer to my family. When the invasion of Leyte began, I thought the road home had finally opened, but before that road could bring me back to them, it almost took me out of the sky for good. At 3:30 in the morning on November 27, 1944, 56 Japanese aircraft, G4M Betty bombers escorted by Zeros, came in low and fast over Tacloban airfield. I was in the operations tent, bent over the plans for the next morning's strike, when the first bombs hit. The shock wave tore through the canvas like it was paper, threw me to the ground, and a scatter of metal fragments ripped into my left leg and shoulder. I tried to stand up, tried to get out to the flight line to check my B-25, but the doctor grabbed my arm and told me I needed surgery immediately. I pushed past him anyway and made it maybe 30 feet before my leg buckled and the world went black. They rushed me to the hospital on Leyte, and when I came to, the surgeon told me it would be 6 months, maybe longer, before I could fly again. They even mentioned medical retirement. 45 years old, 26 years of service, a respectable end. But I told them I wasn't leaving. Not until I knew my family in Manila was free. While I lay there recovering, the Battle of Manila began. House to house, block to block, some of the worst fighting our boys ever saw. On February 3rd, 1945, American troops reached the gates of Santa Tomas internment camp and freed 3,700 prisoners. Someone told me my wife and children were among them, but numbers weren't enough. I needed to see them with my own eyes. The next morning, February 4th, I boarded a plane using a cane and a stubbornness that no doctor could cure. The medics cleared me for light duty, but they couldn't stop me from flying to Manila. When I walked into the makeshift hospital the army had set up inside the camp, I saw rows of people who looked like shadows, thin, hollow-cheeked, wrapped in blankets, and then I saw my family. Paulie looked straight at me but didn't recognize me. I had lost 40 pounds, my hair had gone grey, and months of exhaustion had carved new lines into my face. My daughter weighed only 63 pounds. My son was fighting malaria. The youngest was barely strong enough to lift her head. For a moment, none of them seemed real. Then I said Paulie's name, and she froze, stared, and suddenly she knew. We held each other as best we could, all bones and bandages, and for 4 hours, exactly 4, the army recorded it in the file, our world felt whole again. After that, I had to return to Leyte, legs still wrapped tight, stitches pulling with every step. As the jeep carried me back to the airstrip, I kept thinking about the strange weight settling over me. I had fought for years to get to this moment, to see my family alive again, but I also knew something inside me had changed. The war was still going, the skies were still calling, but I wasn't the same man who had welded guns into the nose of an A-20. I had gotten what I fought for, and it didn't come without cost. When the war finally ended and the shooting stopped, I tried to convince myself I could keep flying the way I always had, but on June 30th, 1948, the army made the decision for me. They retired me on medical grounds with the rank of full colonel and handed me a list of medals that never felt like they belonged to me. Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. Someone had even recommended me for the Distinguished Service Cross, but it never went through. A few officers thought I was just a technical man. Maybe that was true, but the war had taught me that the line between a mechanic and a fighter can be thin as paper. After the paperwork was done, I went back to the Philippines and started rebuilding Philippine Airlines from the ground up. We began with 3 surplus C-47s, the same kind of aircraft that had carried soldiers and cargo through storms and gunfire, and I flew the early routes myself, Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao, then outward to Hong Kong, Bangkok and Singapore. By 1956, we were flying all the way to San Francisco. I stayed in the cockpit as much as I could because peace didn't quiet the engine noise in my head. Every time the propeller spun up, it felt like I was holding off the silence that waited behind me. Those commercial routes weren't just business. They were a way to fill the empty space the war had carved out, a way to keep moving so the memories couldn't catch me. I knew I was still running, though I couldn't have told you from what. On October 10th, 1957, I chartered a Beech 18 for a short flight from Manila to Baguio, a trip I had made many times before. The weather report said only scattered rain, nothing to worry about, and we lifted off into a sky that looked harmless enough. But halfway there, the mountains pulled the storm in tight around us, rain turning to sheets, the wind twisting against the wings, the radio cutting out until there was nothing but static. I remember thinking how small a cockpit can feel when the world outside disappears. The last thing I recall clearly is the dim glow of the instrument panel against the dark clouds ahead, the sense of the airplane fighting to climb, and the feeling, familiar, unwelcome, that fate had reached out once again. What happened next came fast: the storm, the mountain, and the sudden end of lift beneath us. After all the battles I had lived through, all the guns and steel and fire, it was the quiet mountainside that finally rose to meet me. After the crash, when the noise finally faded and the mountainside went quiet, I sometimes think my story kept moving even if I didn't. The Philippine government gave me a state funeral, so they tell me. 6,000 people standing together, veterans in worn uniforms, Philippine Airlines employees in their work shirts, and even former prisoners from Santo Tomas who knew what it meant to survive. I don't linger on the sadness of that day. What matters now is what lived on after me. Nearly 5,000 B-25 Strafer variants were eventually built from the idea we first tested in a dusty airstrip in Australia. Those aircraft helped sink more than 800 Japanese ships, destroyed over 2,000 enemy planes on the ground, and cut down roughly 85,000 Japanese soldiers in the campaigns that followed. I never thought in numbers when I was alive, but when I look back, I understand that the work we did changed more than a few battles. It changed what a bomber could be. Before us, bombers dropped their load from altitude and left. After us, they became multi-role gun platforms, the AC-130 that circles silently over battlefields at night, the A-10 Warthog with its nose-mounted cannon, even the modern attack craft built to fire forward. They're all walking a trail the B-25 carved long before the jet age. My family carried pieces of that trail too. My son Nathaniel flew B-52s over Vietnam, a long way from the jungles where I fought, and when he retired, he wrote a book about me, Pappy Gun, the title simple enough for a man who never wanted monuments. And somewhere in the National Museum of the Pacific War, there's a sheet of yellowed paper, one of my early sketches, 4 .50 calibers drawn into the nose of an A-20. No computers, no math tables, just a pencil line that ended up reshaping a war. Philippine Airlines still hangs my portrait in the lobby, and the employees walk past it day after day without knowing the whole story. The crashes, the weld burns, the nights staring at the sky wondering whether my family was still alive. But that's all right. Most of the men I served with were the same, ordinary people doing things no one had trained them for. And if you're listening to this now, maybe you understand that. Maybe you once fixed a truck no one trusted, or flew an aircraft someone said would never hold together, or pushed through a job because quitting wasn't an option. I was just one of those men. And if you still remember people like us, ordinary men who did uncommon things when the world needed it, then we haven't disappeared. You're the reason this story is still alive,